Welcome to the Eastern Bloc. Maxim Bazilev. To his followers, he was Adolph, a thinker, a tactician, a prophet of blood. To the FSB, he was something far more dangerous. The man who built Russia's most violent neo-Nazi network, the organizer behind the Pushkin and Sergeyev Basad group, cells accused of carrying out over 30 murders across Moscow and its outskirts. He was born, ironically, into comfort. Bazilev entered the world on October 17, 1980 in Moscow, the son of educated middle-class parents who gave him everything that should have kept him far from the streets. He was intelligent, soft-spoken, and highly analytical. Teachers remembered him as quiet boy who read constantly and showed a fascination with history, particularly the military history of the 20th century. But the collapse of the USSR and the chaos that followed reshaped the psychology of a generation. For Bazilev, the fall of ideology created a vacuum, one he filled with rage, purpose, and nationalism. By the time he was 16, he was already running with skinhead gangs, first as a curious teenager, then as a rising leader. He wasn't the biggest or loudest, but he had something more valuable: control. When some of his friends were killed or sentenced to long prison terms, Bazilev remained unnervingly calm. He never showed no emotion. Some called him a psychopath, others said he was schizophrenic. Unlike many of his peers who drank, bragged, and lived for street fights, Basilov treated the movement like a science. He built hierarchies, studied police patterns, monitored radio channels, and gathered information on rappers and anti-fascists. He began printing leaflets, editing underground magazines, and preaching that to simply beat up an enemy isn't enough. It is better to kill. By the early 2000s, Bazilov's name was known to every major far-right faction. In Moscow, he called himself Adolph in homage to Hitler. But unlike most skinheads who mimicked fascist symbols without understanding them, Basilov studied the ideology obsessively. To his disciples, he was a strategist, someone who could turn scattered brutality into organized revolution. The FSB later concluded that Basilov personally coordinated the Pushkin and Sergeyev Basad groups, small paramilitary units composed of radicalized young men trained in hand-to-hand combat and weapon handling. These cells were responsible for a wave of xenophobic murders between 2005 and 2008. They filmed their killings, posted videos online, and circulated them among far-right communities as propaganda, a form of terror disguised as ideology. Basilov, styling himself as both agitator and ideologue, he organized nationalist rallies across Moscow, small at first, then larger, bolder, gatherings wrapped in patriotic slogans, but charged with menace. Standing on improvised stages or monument steps, he delivered fierce speeches to crowds of shaved heads and black jackets. His voice calm, deliberate, almost academic. He spoke of reviving Russian pride, of cleansing the nation. Write and printed magazines and gave out leaflets to the young people. In one of his many attacks, a brutal assault on a Turkish man finally brought him to the attention of police. During the chaos of that night, one of his accomplices dropped his passport at the scene, a mistake that would unravel the entire crew. By the next morning, officers were knocking on Basilov's door. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Those years behind bars hardened him. For Basilov, prison wasn't punishment. It was education. The teenager who once fought in the streets for adrenaline had transformed into a man preparing for ideological war. In 2004, he joined the National Socialist Society, a group that presented itself as a legal nationalist party but functioned as a breeding ground for militant cells. Bazilev became one of its most capable organizers. Under his influence, the Moscow region soon divided into the territorial divisions: NSO West, NSO Southeast, and his own creation, NSO North. The NSO presented itself as the only legal national socialist organization in Russia, one that was openly preparing to fight for political power in the country. It was founded by nationalist Dmitry Rumyantsev. Independent candidates from NSO took part in local election in the Moscow region in 2005 and again in the winter of 2007, 2008, though they always lost. The organization's ideologues promoted the theory of racial and national superiority of Russians as the Tito nation. Their activities were serious and organized: rallies, propaganda campaigns, and online agitation. Young recruits were drawn in by the promise of structure and purpose. Military style training sessions where they were taught how to handle weapons and storm buildings and fight hand to hand. As the court investigation later revealed, members of the NSO were responsible for 27 murders. Most of their victims were migrant workers and anti fascists, though sometimes they made mistakes and killed Russians who had nothing to do with anti fascism. These people lived in constant fear of being watched. They imagined ears everywhere, convinced that FSB was tracking their every move. Their paranoia eventually turned inward. They ended up killing one of their own members, whom they suspected of collaborating with security services. And it wasn't just murder. They knocked him unconscious with a blow to the head, dragged him into a bathtub, and while he was still alive, cut off his head singing "Where Does the Motherland Begin?", one of the classic Russian songs. As they did it, the entire act was filmed on camera, and the footage was later uploaded to the internet. That was what finally led law enforcement to their trail. NSO Sever, the northern branch, carried out not only murders but also planned terrorist attack. One of the convicted men confessed that they had been preparing to blow up the Zagorsk hydroelectric station in the Sergei Posad district. The countryside house where the neo-Nazis were arrested was packed with explosives and detonators. Investigators were never able to determine who exactly financed NSO Sever, but there was no shortage of money. Through the organization, neo-Nazis were relocated from other regions into the Moscow suburbs and given credit cards from which they could withdraw between 2,000 and 25,000 rubles per month. They also robbed small shops and market stalls in northern Moscow, pulling the stolen cars into a shared fund, the Abshak. Almost all of those convicted had regular jobs, and some even studied at universities. Among them, Vasilisa Kovalova, a fifth-year journalism student at Moscow State University, a girl from an educated, respectable family, who received 19 years in prison for her part in one of the murders, to be sentenced to 19 years at the age of 22. His life destroyed. Yet during the trial, the neo-Nazis behaved as though the catastrophic sentences meant nothing to them. They laughed, cursed, smoked the court, shouted threats at the prosecutor. The FSB and journalists screamed "Glory to Rus" and promised that they would return. They lived their whole lives without ever facing real brutal resistance. An officer told they would attack one or two migrant workers as a pack, but never in large groups. And since the attacks were always successful, they began to see themselves as invincible, as people chosen by some higher truth. That's why they behave so outrageously, even now. On March 2009, while detained and questioned as a suspect, Bazilev gave testimony against members of his organization. He was tortured badly. Bazilev was reclassified from a suspect to an accused. As an accused, he refused to give testimony under Article 51. He was killed under unclear circumstances in his cell at the Moscow Temporary Detention Center on Petrovka 38. According to reports, he bled slowly for over half an hour before dying. Investigators later noted that it would have practically impossible to smuggle a blade into that cell, but correctional officers are required to check inmates every 5 minutes. Official cause of his death noted as suicide. His neck and his wrists were sliced. On Maxim Bazilev's bank account, investigators discovered more than 200 million rubles. According to one version, these funds could have come either from fraud or from political sponsors. His close friend and comrade from those years, Roman Ifontov, better known under the pseudonym Dmitry Nesterov, described the events of their youth in his book Skins, Rus Awakens. The book is based on real events and recounts the actual deeds of these people. When he learned that his friend Adolph had died in prison, fearing arrest and torture, he shot himself in his apartment. So was the story of Maxim Adolph Bazilev, a man who died a slow and painful death at just 28. He left behind no children, no legacy, nothing that time would remember kindly. And for what? Today, the skinhead movement he once lived and killed for is gone, buried in the same dirt as its leaders. Moscow streets are filled with the very people he hated: Caucasians, Chechens, migrants, Asians, Africans, living their lives, moving forward.